Hello and welcome. I want to alert everyone that this program is being recorded. My name is Sally Ward, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Baltimore City. This is the second event planned by the Joint Committee of Baltimore City and Baltimore County
Join the meeting.
League of Women Voters. We are delighted that there are people here on this Zoom from across Maryland and across the United States. Please type in the chat where you are from. The League is a nonpartisan grassroots organization where members can step up and get involved. The League feels it is very important for everyone to be an educated voter, and the League of Women Voters are here to help. Please notice in the chat that there are 3 links to use. 1, the Maryland Voter Guide. 2, how to find a league near you. And 3, election information you might need at vote411.org. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat. One of our committee, Mara, will share them with our speaker. Now, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Bret Schafer, Media and Digital Disinformation Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. As an expert on computational propaganda, he has appeared in the New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and many more. He has spent more than 10 years in the TV and film industry. Thank you, Bret Schafer, for being here today to tell us about defending democracy from disinformation, how to protect the election from information manipulation. Take it away, Bret.
Thank you, Sally, and it's good to be back at the League. I think this is my 4th or 5th time doing a presentation for various chapters, and I've always gotten really great questions at the end of it, so hopefully I've refined my presentation a little bit based on some of the feedback from earlier presentations. So I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen here quickly, and then I'm going to walk through maybe a 30 to 35-minute presentation, and then we can turn it over to Q&A. 1 second. Okay, so you should all be seeing my screen now, and I'm just going to minimize you so it's not in the way. So this presentation today, it's going to talk about combating mainly disinformation. So the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is essentially just false information.
Join the meeting.
Disinformation is false information when there's actually an intent to mislead an audience. So misinformation is rife across social media. I mean, if anyone has a Facebook account, you have likely seen misinformation every single time you've logged in, coming from family and friends and just the media ecosystem in general. Disinformation is a little bit more specific. Disinformation is what we tend to look at coming from nation states. So Russians actually invented the word disinformatia. But now we've seen disinformation as a tactic that has really been picked up by domestic players as well. So today I'm going to walk you through some of the threats we have seen, also some ways to combat disinformation. A lot of my examples will be looking at the Russia context, just because my work more specifically focuses on foreign actors. But basically everything I'm talking about also applies to domestic players as well. So when we talk about disinformation, I think a lot of the focus is often on the content. So individual pieces of disinformation, pieces that appear to be false or misleading about how to vote, when to vote, where to vote, or about a candidate. But when we talk about disinformation, we put it into a broader perspective. So kind of a way that we like to think of it is the ABCs of disinformation. So there's the actor, there's the behavior, and then there's the content. And in many ways, those of us who try to combat disinformation spend more time looking at the actor and the behavior rather than the content itself. But I'll walk you through those 3 different parts of the sort of disinformation ecosystem. So the actor, when we think about disinformation actors, again, we tend to think about Russian trolls just because they were so successful in 2015 and 2016. Also, Russian intelligence agencies. So the GRU, which is military intelligence, they're really involved more in the hacking and leaking of information online. But as I mentioned, the threat actors have exploded over the past 4 years. One of the problems with how successful Russia was in 2015 and 2016, other people saw how easy it was, how relatively cheap it is to run a disinformation campaign. So now we've seen an explosion of players on social media who are running these really sophisticated disinformation operations. So one of the things that's particularly concerning is now there's an entire marketplace for manipulation that exists online. So if you are in a county where there is an election of interest, you don't have to have a ton of money, any real tech savvy. You just have to have some bad intentions and a little bit of money, and you can Google various companies who will run these kind of disinformation campaigns for you. So I like to say, if you want to know how to manipulate Google search results, you just Google it, and they'll give you an entire list of companies. They'll basically rate them as if you're trying to buy car insurance. And now there's this explosion of companies who will give you fake followers and fake likes, boost your views in ways that are artificial. And then if you move sort of to the dark web, there are companies running out of Israel and Belarus and the Philippines who will run these really sort of targeted smear campaigns for you. So what that means is we now not only have to worry about the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese and political candidates running campaigns, we just have to worry about individuals targeting, maybe down ballot candidates, ballot measures, which again, they can do for very little money and with no real technical expertise. So the second part of this sort of ABC taxonomy is behavior. So behavior are the tactics and techniques used to deceive audiences. So what we mean by that is using things like impersonation or misrepresentation, or what Facebook calls coordinated inauthentic behavior. So what that means is the content itself that is shared by these actors oftentimes is not false. When I have done some of the work looking into what the Internet Research Agency did, running out of St. Petersburg, targeting Americans, 98% of the content that they shared on social media was objectively true. What made it disinformation is because they misrepresented who they were. So you see on the right there, this is actually an IRA account run by a troll in St. Petersburg, purporting to be a Black activist in the United States. So this account, Louisa Haynes, she tweeted under the name Woke Louisa. She tweeted about everything from the NFL protests to police violence to the 2016 election. And she had a following of about 40,000 people, which is significant to say the least, and was actually picked up by many major media outlets in the US. So her tweets about the NFL protest were used as sort of a representation of Black America by outlets like Time and Newsweek. So the influence oftentimes jumps from social media into traditional media. But when we look again at disinformation, it's the behavior being used. It's efforts to try to conceal who you are. And of course, that's quite easy on the internet because you can be anonymous on the internet, and to misrepresent your intentions. And so that's a particular concern when we see these sort of spamming campaigns and other efforts to try to get certain pieces of content in front of audiences. Because what we know from social psychology is audiences are more receptive to information that come from people that look like you, that talk like you, that share your beliefs. So what we see oftentimes is disinformation actors set up these false personas as a way to insinuate themselves into audiences and then to try to manipulate those audiences from within. So I did a lot of work looking at the targeting of Black activists in 2015, 2016. And what we saw there was, again, most of these accounts that were run out of Russia just shared information that most of the rest of the activist community was sharing. So they just sort of piggybacked off of whatever was in the news cycle. But then once they had a following, once they were inside these communities, they just moved the needle an inch or two in a certain direction around specific topics. So namely support for Hillary Clinton, if we're looking at the 2016 context. So what we saw in these sort of fake Black activists that were created by Russia was uniformly there was a message to support third-party candidates or not to vote at all. So while 98% of the content they shared was true, was just sharing content that was in the general information ecosystem, we saw them trying to manipulate this one conversation topic, but obviously a significant one, from within. So another thing you can see there is the spoofing of accounts that are made to look to be almost authentic, where they will just change maybe one letter or one digit or add an underscore, something a normal audience wouldn't really pick up on. So the example here is actually looking at Radio Free Asia, which is a US government funded outlet overseas, and then a Chinese government effort to basically impersonate that account. So left and right there, those two examples look almost identical. The only way you can tell the authentic one versus the inauthentic one is this small blue check mark on the left. That means it's authentic. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about the importance of verification a little bit later. But the average viewer who's just scrolling through their phone, they're likely not going to pick up on the fact that this false account hasn't been verified. And that's a really deceptive way, again, of pushing misleading information from a seemingly legitimate or trustworthy source. And then finally, the content. So again, the content is what we spend a lot of time focusing on. It's what the media tends to cover. So it's false, misleading, or manipulated information, which can be images, text, or audio. So you probably heard a little bit about deepfakes. So deepfakes are, of course, the ability to essentially make someone say something that they never said or do something they never did. Video deepfakes are not really to the point yet where they are particularly convincing. They're getting close, but audio is already there. The ability to manipulate a piece of audio content to make it seem entirely authentic, that technology already exists. So that, of course, is another concern. In 2020, if you think about things that came out in 2016, like the Access Hollywood tape, that at this point can be entirely manufactured or at least spliced and manipulated to mislead audiences. So in the election context, we tend to look at sort of three different types of election-related disinfo. So the first is voter suppression. That's just false information about how, when, and where to vote. We've, of course, seen voter suppression tactics using those sort of techniques forever. They've just been hypercharged in the sort of digital space. The good thing about voter suppression disinformation is it almost always violates the tech companies, so Facebook, Twitter, Google's terms of service. So if you see something on Twitter or Facebook that is misleading an audience about how to vote or when to vote, and you report that to the companies, they will take it down, or they should take it down, because it's definitely in violation of their terms of service. So the sort of second bucket of election-related disinfo we look at is voter fraud claims. So these, of course, are false claims of illegal voting, of machines malfunctioning. Of course, right now, what we're seeing is focusing a lot on mail-in ballots, so stolen or tampered mail-in ballots. This can occur, of course, before an election, but also after the election. And I think in the sort of COVID world, and given what we've seen leading up to this election, we have a lot of concern about what's going to happen after November 3rd this year. So particularly if we see a county where the percentages shift pretty dramatically from what we saw in 2016 or even 2018, I think it's likely that we will see voter fraud narratives pushed out by, whichever campaign deems it to be beneficial. Although to be fair, one campaign is probably more likely than the other. The problem with the voter fraud claims is they don't always necessarily violate terms of service. So somebody posting onto social media, we can't trust the postal service, ballots are being lost, it's easy to manipulate mail-in ballots. All of that is generally permissible. So it's sort of hard for the tech companies to adjudicate voter fraud claims. And then the last bucket, which I'm not going to spend a ton of time looking at, are political related disinformation campaigns. So these would be false claims about the candidates, their political parties, their supporters. Obviously, we've seen a lot of that occurring already. It'll happen before, during, and after election. Rarely does it violate terms of service. We don't focus very heavily on it just because it gets political, it gets partisan very quickly. And my guess would be as the league, you would want to spend less time focusing on political disinformation. A, just because there's so much of it, it's sort of impossible to put out all those fires. B, again, it just sort of automatically drifts into a partisan space. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about political related disinformation campaigns. So when we talk about voter suppression, these are two efforts that we saw, one in 2016, one in 2018. So the image on the right there is a photoshopped image that was put out on social media before during the governor race in Georgia, purporting to say that Black Panthers were patrolling polling places, and you see this photoshopped Stacey Abrams campaign sign in their hand. The example on the left is what I'm really, really concerned about this time around because of COVID and all of the changes that are necessary to protect people's health in terms of opening up different avenues for voters to send in their ballots to vote remotely. So this was a campaign that we saw in 2016, essentially telling Clinton supporters, and it looks like an authentic Clinton campaign announcement, that they can text in their vote just by texting Hillary to that number below. We saw similar campaigns telling people they could tweet in their vote. Many of them specifically targeted Black and Latino voters as well. My guess in 2016 is that effort wasn't particularly successful because most people probably just showed up to the same polling place they've been going to their entire voting life. This time around, I'm really, really concerned about these kind of efforts because, of course, people are going to be actively seeking out new ways to vote. And these kind of campaigns are just going to have more credibility in the COVID world because, of course, there have been changes to how we can vote. So then the second bucket, again, is sort of voter fraud. So these are all examples that come from our Russian friends. So you see here this meme that was put out on social media during the last election saying that voting machines in Texas, people were going in and putting in a Republican ticket and we're getting Clinton Kane results instead, or that illegals were voting. We've also seen in Russia's state media them really amplifying, messages that we've seen come out of our own political leaders about voting fraud and that mail-in voting is not safe. So we see a lot of amplification of domestic narratives in state media coming from Russia, but again, our own media ecosystem is particularly problematic as well. So voter fraud is sort of the second avenue that we look at here. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and this is going to appear to be coming totally out of left field given the presentation and the topic. But I want to talk a little bit about information manipulation and how what we look at now is different than classic disinformation, which again usually does kind of focus in on the behavior or the content itself. But I want to look at how audiences, how voters can be manipulated at sort of the structural level of how the information ecosystem is built online. So this example here, this was a restaurant in London called the Shed of Dulwich that was this sort of avant-garde restaurant. It came online. It obviously, like every restaurant, had no reviews, no real ratings. So it slowly over time built up an audience through positive reviews on the type of sites that we all visit to get reviews of where to eat, especially when we travel. So on TripAdvisor in London, whenever you open a new restaurant, you start at the very back of the line. So this was the 18,000th ranked restaurant in all of London when it first appeared. Over the course of a year, more and more positive rankings were coming in. Word of mouth started, boosting its popularity. In about 9 months, the Shed at Dulwich went from the last rated restaurant in London to the #1 rated restaurant in all of London. So, phones were ringing off the hook. It was basically impossible to get a reservation. The reason it was impossible is because this restaurant never existed. It was a fake restaurant. It was a joke. It was a prank played by a journalist from Vice News in London, just to show how easy it is to manipulate ranking systems and information systems online. So here you have a restaurant that doesn't even exist, and it is able to, just through this sort of, I think it was the journalist friends who were posting positive reviews, was able to manipulate the most trusted rating system and move a restaurant that didn't exist to the top of the chart in one of the one of the busiest metropolitan areas in the world. So that's just an example of, frankly, how easy it is to manipulate what users see and what voters see in front of them and their perception of reality. The term that we use is perception hacking. So it's a way of just kind of changing the reality around us in ways that most of us just frankly don't understand, because we don't understand how the algorithms work and we don't see this sort of back end manipulation at work. So this, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about search engine manipulation and the tactics and techniques used there. So this is a quote from a colleague of mine who said, if you make it trend, you make it true. And what that means is, if you are able to get your piece of content trending so that it shows up in people's news feeds, it shows up at the top of Google searches, it becomes reality for people, because we all sort of assume that Google is built to show us credible information. When we run just a sort of a very sort of innocuous search for something, we assume we're being served the best results. But of course, behind the scenes, bad actors are working to manipulate those algorithms. And they do that through a variety of ways. So one is just high volume posting from multiple sources. So you essentially just kind of spam the information space with this content. So if you're running a disinformation campaign, we've seen this from the Russians, they will run a campaign across multiple platforms, not just Facebook and Twitter and Google. Every single social media platform out there, they'll have blog posts, they'll have comments and comment sections. So that not only just gets it in front of more people who just happen to be in these different spots, it also sort of games the popularity, it games the algorithm. So algorithms are based on virality. They want to show you what's popular, what's trending. All of that can be manipulated though. So bad actors, one of the tactics is just to essentially flood the information space with whatever piece of false information they want to get out there, because they understand it's not just about having an individual come in contact with a single post. It's about many, many posts that will just manipulate the popularity of the post. So when I talk to my parents, for example, about what's happening on Facebook and how both domestic and foreign actors really try to manipulate what people see in front of them, my mom will reply, like, I'm on Facebook to see pictures of my grandchildren. I don't have political conversations there. I'm certainly not engaging in conversations with Russian trolls or strangers. All of that is true and likely true for a lot of people. But what you don't see is what just pops up in your news feed, what just is shown in front of you without people really realizing why it's there. All of that can be manipulated, and it can be manipulated in quite sophisticated ways. So one of the things that we look at that always a concern is this concept called data voids. So data voids is a term that was coined by Data and Society, which means it's a search term for which the available or relevant data is limited, non-existent, or deeply problematic. Now, what that means in practice is, if you go to a search engine, take Google, and you run a search, any kind of search, Google is built to try to give you the most relevant and the most trustworthy results. Generally speaking, if you run a query on something that Google has seen quite often, it's very good at giving you credible and trustworthy information. Where Google does not do very well, and no search engine does particularly well, is when people run a query on a term that the platform just hasn't seen before. So there's not a lot of information there, because it's still built to serve you whatever is there. So it is just going to serve you up whatever is available. And if there's not much available, it can be very problematic information. So think of it as like going into a library. If you ask a librarian for a book about World War II history, there are volumes and volumes and volumes of great books out there. If the librarian is good, he or she is going to recommend something to you that probably is pretty credible, pretty trustworthy. If you go to a library and ask for a book on a topic where there's not much there, or more specifically, in most cases, something that has just happened, so think of a breaking news environment, that librarian just doesn't have a lot to pull from. So if there's only one book in the library, that's what you're going to be served. And this is a huge concern on search engines, because if you think of a fast-paced breaking news environment like Election Day, where there are going to be constant pieces of false information that pop up during the course of the day. That means that credible journalists just aren't going to have time to refute that information. And you'll often see really problematic content surfacing at the top of people's feeds. So that sort of wraps up the kind of doom and gloom part of the presentation, where I go over the threats. But I do want to kind of outline, what we can do about it, both as individuals and then as the league. So a couple of best practices here for ways we go about trying to combat or trying to debunk disinformation. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, so I don't need to go through the whole song and dance that I sometimes do when I talk to college kids or another group about the importance of not sharing false information. That sort of goes without saying, but I will just sort of repeat the point, particularly as trusted election voices. Even inadvertently sharing a piece of content that is proven later to be false can be deeply damaging to your individual credibility, the credibility of the league, and it's just bad for sort of trust in the community. The other thing to do, if you see a piece of false content, particularly shared by family or friends, arm yourself with the facts before engaging. So just telling a person they're wrong is typically not very helpful. What you need to have are sort of the available and relevant facts to back up your point and to disprove whatever is out there. Another thing is to be aware of the Streisand effect. So the Streisand effect is named after Barbra Streisand and a lawsuit that she had, essentially trying to get people to stop photographing her beach house. This, in turn, the lawsuit itself actually caused so much more attention and so many more people to kind of focus in on her house that it created this sort of, reverse reaction where, in trying to get people to stop focusing or stop photographing her house, she, in essence, created much more of a public interest around it and created these huge crowds that would show up at her beach house. So in combating disinformation, we need to be aware of the Streisand effect, that sometimes calling attention to false information gives it oxygen and gives it a larger platform. So there are times, and all of these things that I'm outlining here, this is my job, and I will say I fail at this on a daily, if not weekly basis in terms of when to respond to something and when to let it die. But sometimes it is better to let something, leave something alone, because by calling attention to it, you're just putting that seed in people's mind. You're just creating a demand to kind of seek out information around it. So just be aware of it. If something is not getting a lot of traction, if a lot of people aren't seeing it, sometimes it's better to just let it be. If, however, you do want to combat a piece of false information, the best advice is to not repeat that false information. So take, for example, if there is disinformation about mail-in ballots, and it very specifically says, on the outside of the envelope, it is printed whether you're a Republican or Democrat, and therefore that means if you had a partisan mail carrier, they could see if you're an R or a D, and depending on their political leanings, they can weed out your ballots and throw them away. This is an actual campaign that we have seen kind of circulating around social media. The best way to refute that is not to talk about that specific piece of false information. It's to say, essentially, there is false information going around social media about mail-in ballots. Here's the reality of what is actually printed on the outside of your envelope, how your vote is secured, how your identity is secured. So you're reaffirming the truth as opposed to kind of calling more attention to the original false post. And then be aware of the backfire effect. So a little bit different from the Streisand effect. What we know from some of the research into disinformation and people's beliefs is that when they are called out on spreading false information, or a belief of theirs is debunked, if it is done in a way that threatens that individual or that calls out that person, oftentimes that hardens their belief in their false opinion. So we see this backfire effect in, if you kind of aggressively point out, again, that this is more relevant if you're talking about family, friends sharing this. If you engage in a way that's really confrontational and negative, that often causes that person to sort of wall themselves off and hardens their belief. So try to be dispassionate, avoid escalation when you try to debunk disinformation. And I added a little link down there from PEN America, who has a great PDF on how to talk to friends and family who share misinformation. It was useful for me. I can't tell you how frustrating it is, given it's my job to look at disinformation. And when I go on Facebook, which I don't do often, and I see my own family members sharing pieces of information I know to be false, the knee-jerk reaction is to call them out on it and say, you know, what are you doing? How can you possibly think this is true? But it's really more effective, A, to not do it publicly. So try to ping them offline or at least in a direct message, but then, you know, try to engage them in a way that isn't confrontational, doesn't escalate the situation. So then finally, I wanted to look kind of more from the league perspective at what you all can be doing to combat disinformation. So first is just create content and post often. You know, as I outlined, the bad actors are trying to spam different information platforms with false information. Like that is part of the strategy, to post early, to post often, and get it in as many places as possible, in front of as many eyeballs as possible. So we all need to be doing the same, but doing it with credible information. But the focus really should be, this is sort of a cheesy term, on pre-bunking instead of debunking. What that means is if you're trying to debunk false pieces of information, you're always playing from behind because you're waiting for a false piece of or a false story to show up. Then you're having to do the research to figure out why it's false. By the time you have debunked something, we know how fast the sort of digital information moves. It's already out there. In essence, you kind of lost. So we want to focus more on pre-bunking, inoculating people from disinformation. So what that means is, if we're talking in the election-related context, make sure people in your community, your friends, your family, they understand the voting processes. If changes happen due to health concerns or anything else prior to the election, get that information out in front of people, because if they know the reality, they are less likely to seek out this sort of dystopian reality that's created by disinformation operators. So another thing is to ensure that the league's communication channels are secure, when possible, verify them, and that they're active. You know, we see a lot of election official accounts that, yeah, they, you know, somebody told them in the state office they need to set up a Twitter account and a Facebook account. They did it, and they never touched those accounts again. That's not really helpful. It's also not helpful to start posting the day before an election. You need to build an audience. So create content, be active, and again, make sure you just use sort of basic security procedures, two-factor authentication on official accounts, and where you can to try to verify those accounts. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a second. The other thing is you are trusted voices within your communities, more so than, you know, average concerned citizens. So it is especially important to have information coming out of the league, coming out of league members, because presumably people within your communities know your affiliation, you know, they trust the league, and they will trust information coming from you more than, you know, their neighbor down the street who knows where they got their information from. As I already mentioned, flood social and traditional media with factual information. Also, another great tactic is create information sharing mechanisms. So various leagues can share the threats they're seeing. Oftentimes, disinformation threats are not they will appear to be hyper localized, because they will mention something happening in Baltimore. But in fact, we're seeing an identical narrative pop up across the country. So the more that local leagues can create these information sharing mechanisms, so that, you know, Baltimore and San Diego are connected, and we're saying, hey, we're seeing this specific thing bubbling up in Baltimore, you seeing the same thing. It just helps to have a sense of what's out there, and also sharing best practices for how to refute a very specific piece of false information. Also, form relationships with the social media platforms so you can elevate threats to the appropriate parties. One of the big concerns we have is that the platforms just get flooded with so many takedown requests that they're not really able to prioritize ones where there really is a true concern there. So I outlined there. For MITRE has a project called Squint. Stanford has an election integrity partnership. What those basically are ticketing systems, so that trusted communities, and I know the league is connected in some way with MITRE, so the trusted voices can essentially kind of turn in a piece of disinformation they're seeing or concern they have with information they're seeing to sort of a central repository. That repository can do a little bit of work on it to make sure it is a credible threat. And then they can elevate it to the social media platforms when presumably they're going to take quicker action against it, because now it is something that has been sort of funneled through a central repository, as opposed to having 9,000 different league members all reporting the same thing to a platform, which just it just kind of overwhelms their fact checkers and everything else. And then finally, work with state and local officials to improve information security and ensure changes to election procedures are messaged early and often. So at the Alliance for Security and Democracy, we actually teamed up with Common Cause on a project to try to get counties in 10 battleground states just to verify their Twitter accounts and their Facebook accounts. So as you see here on the left, Baltimore County's Board of Elections, they're verified on Twitter. So they're good. Everything looks okay with their Twitter account. It's verified, it's active. That's a good thing. On the right is Chatham County, Georgia, which is where I went to high school. This is an example of what not to do as an election official account. As you see there, there's no profile image, there's no banner image. It joined in October 2011. It has never posted, it's unverified. This is a really problematic account, not just because it's not sharing credible information with the community, but also this is an account that can be easily hijacked or spoofed by bad actors. So some of those examples I showed earlier of bad actors trying to create an account that just looks like an official account. When the official account isn't verified, when it hasn't done anything, it would be very easy for someone to set up an account just saying Chatham GA votes or Chatham GA won. For the next couple of weeks, push out what appears to be credible voting related information. And then on election day, essentially turn the switch and start pushing out false results to try to mislead voters. So this is something that I think the league can be very helpful with. Talk to your local election boards, get them verified. Twitter prioritizes verifying election-related accounts. So if they do a couple simple steps, it would take them 5 minutes. They would get verified. It would make it much more difficult to hijack or hack that account. And then on Facebook, it is particularly important because Facebook has a new initiative where if you are a verified election-related account, your posts actually get elevated in people's feeds. So it's not just about information security, it's about information prioritization. Facebook is just going to show content coming out of the various pages that they know to be connected to election officials, but those pages have to be verified first. Facebook calls it blue badging. They have to be blue badged, and when they are, that means, you know, presumably the trustworthy information coming from the Board of Elections will be prioritized over, you know, just the random garbage that is out there. So that's it for the presentation. I think I'll pause there and open it up to questions. So I will turn it back over to you all.
Hey, well, that was great. I mean, I feel like I'm on high alert now, which I suspect we all are, because there are some questions in the Q&A, hoping that we could get a copy of the PowerPoint. People want to be able to look at it again. And okay, great.
Absolutely.
That's really great. So we can send that link to everyone who's on the Zoom call today. I'm not exactly sure that you'll get it today. But you will get it, because we all do. And there were some great links in there that it's really hard to write those down. We need to.
Yes, absolutely. I will share that.
Great, thank you. So one of the questions I received in advance is, as voters, what are the top 3 things we should do and watch for in 2020? I mean, you've given us like the top 200, but if somebody can only concentrate on a couple of things, what should we be concentrating on?
If we're talking more about efforts to protect the information space and make sure those around us also have accurate information, I would prioritize focusing on the voter suppression kind of efforts that we see. Make sure people know how, when, and where to vote. So there's 2 different ways to go about that. As I mentioned, pre-bunking. So just take ownership of your community, whatever that means to you, whether it's friends and family or a little bit broader, and post, again, early and often, how to vote, where to vote, the different ways you can vote, linked to, you know, credible election sources. I know it feels redundant, repetitive, and I'm guilty of the same thing. You post once, you think everyone in your friend group has seen it. That's just not how it works. So post maybe, you know, maybe not daily, but weekly and then daily as we get closer to the election. So that's one. And then two is if you see false information about how, when, and where to vote, that's actually where the platforms are pretty good. And flagging that, whether that's, again, working with somebody like MITRE or Stanford to kind of push it to a repository, or just flagging it yourself or through a league channel to the platforms, that's going to be pretty effective. Because again, that absolutely clearly violates terms of service. In some cases, it violates law too. So they're going to take quick action against it. I would say the thing to be concerned about, or at least aware of, is the aftermath of the election this year. I am more concerned about that period in this election than I have with any prior election, just because, you know, we know because of just mail-in ballots and because of COVID, we are likely to see, it is likely that results are going to take longer. And it is likely that results are going to shift just sort of based on what we know to be the demographics of who plans to vote in person versus who plans to vote by mail. So we need to remain kind of hyper vigilant after the election, because, you know, we always say you don't have to hack an election to hack people's perception of the election and its security and reliability. So if people don't trust the results, it is just as bad as if Russian hackers went in and actually did change people's votes. So, you know, I used to sort of joke prior to this that, like, as a disinformation person, like, election day was sort of like December 26th for Santa Claus for me. Like, my work was done, disinformation campaigns were wrapped up, there's not much left to be done. That is definitely not the case this time around. Whether it's a week, whether it's a month, our focus is really on sort of post-election disinfo campaigns. So we can't kind of wrap up our work on the 3rd. I think that was probably, that was maybe two specific ones and fanned out from there, but I'll end there.
You answered a question I hadn't asked yet, which was great. I was going to ask about the post-election, because I think there's a very good chance we won't know at least the presidential results on November 3rd, no matter how late we stay up. But I have a question here that applies specifically to Election Day that I think is really pertinent to what we're talking about. What do we do on Election Day when false information, for example, falsely reporting on polling site relocation? How do we quickly identify this disinformation and correct it? We're talking about a matter of hours and minutes.
Yeah, that's the really challenging period. And it's also what I mentioned with focusing on data voids, because you are going to see data voids, because whatever piece of false information that comes up will likely be brand new. So a search engine won't have figured out how to essentially suppress bad information and elevate good information. So I don't want to get kind of too far off track here, but in talking to Google, one of the things they mentioned is that like 15% of queries they see every day are entirely new. They've never seen it before. So the example they gave me, this was a couple years ago, was if you remember that Thai soccer team that got stuck in the cave and they had to do this sort of cave rescue. So they'd never seen Thai soccer team cave rescue. Those were just words never put together before. So when bad actors targeted that query, when people ran it, you just got crazy results at the beginning. And we see this after every mass shooting incident, for example, like El Paso Walmart shooting. That's never been searched for before. Now a ton of people are searching for it. Credible journalists are trying to figure out what's going on, and people who don't care about credible information are posting first. And so the public is exposed to this really problematic information. So that's just to set the stage of why Election Day itself is really, really challenging, because it's so fast moving. You're going to see so many different narratives pop up, and the platforms themselves are not going to be prepared for them, just because, again, many of them are going to be very new and very specific. One of the things I would emphasize is to patrol your own space. And what I mean by that is be vigilant about the kind of narratives that you're seeing popping up in whatever county or whatever city you live in. Because if you try to police the entire world of false information on election day, it's just impossible. You're not going to do it. You're going to be overwhelmed by it. So run queries on the social media platforms, but also in Google of, Baltimore City election fraud, Baltimore City election intimidation, the kind of things we know that are going to pop up in stories, which in theory should show you what's out there in the world. It should show you what people are talking about. So target your queries based on what we know to be sort of past efforts to manipulate voters. And that should, again, kind of highlight what's out there. But again, the best way is to just keep posting and posting and posting and posting about this is, these are your polling locations. This is how you can vote. If there are going to be snafus on election day, as there always are. If there are long lines or a change happens, just help kind of amplify the messaging coming out of trusted election officials. Because again, unfortunately, you're going to see more instances of false information than you can effectively debunk, even if it were your full-time job, which it obviously isn't for most people.
Yeah. Well, this kind of goes with another question. In addition to pre-bunking now, since we're not at election day yet, how can we provide a sense of calm confidence in the process to voters? Because people are feeling, in many cases, kind of doubtful.
Yes.
As you talked about earlier, many people have never done mail-in ballots before or put them into ballot boxes. There's a lot of uncertainty.
It's a great question. It's something I struggle with in my role because, of course, my role is to highlight disinformation campaigns. But again, I don't want to do it in a way that sort of undermines confidence, because that, of course, is in many cases the ultimate goal, particularly if we talk about Russian efforts. And this time around, when we look at Russian efforts, I frankly am not concerned about disinformation targeting a specific candidate, although it's out there. I am concerned about their efforts, and we have already seen this pop up, just to undermine American confidence in democracy itself or the electoral process. So, it's a very kind of fine line of how you call attention to the tactics and techniques used by bad actors to manipulate without then getting people to doubt everything they see around them or just not to trust anything. So I try to be cautious in public statements, although it doesn't always come through. But I do think it is a role for a league to point out when election officials are doing something well, and when there are certain security measures that are in place that would deal with some of the false kind of information out there. There was a Meet the Press, I think 2 weeks ago, that actually walked viewers through how mail-in ballots are processed. I think it was somewhere in California. That was really, really effective watching that, because you just saw the sort of point-by-point security procedures that are in place. So I think what is effective is it's generally not effective to just say, no, it's safe, everything is fine, because you're right. I think all of us feel pretty uncertain this time around. But if you can walk or point viewers to news reports or other pieces of information that kind of step by step walk people through, how this works. The ballot drop boxes that are in certain places. We're seeing disinformation campaigns about those being hacked into and tampered with. Well, I don't know if this is the case across the country, but in Ohio, for example, and other states, like those are under 24-hour video surveillance. So pointing out things like that would refute some of the pieces of, that would help kind of assuage concerns around security, I think is really helpful. But it's a real challenge kind of threading that needle of like alerting people to threats, but not scaring them and not kind of creating more doubt in their mind.
Yeah. So going back to disinformation, a question we've gotten is, would you agree with saying that disinformation campaign, hold on a second. Okay, sorry about that. It's went off my screen. The disinformation campaigns are the largest modern threat to democracy. If you agree, how do you see democracy, voting, and voters developing in the future to not be affected so much by this technology disinformation? So in other words, you know, clearly we have to make some shifts. So if disinformation is the biggest problem, how do we, over the next few years, make ourselves a little bit more bulletproof towards it?
Right. I think, well, one of the important things that we always stressed until recently, where just the election has taken over everything, is disinformation campaigns targeting democracies are not always targeted at elections. It's not all about elections. It is this sort of constant drip of false information meant to kind of erode trust in institutions. Again, I look at this kind of through the Russian lens of how they target US audiences, but oftentimes it sort of exacerbates some of these you know, social fissures that we've obviously had forever, but you know, in the last 6 months have been amplified. So, you know, my perspective is maybe warped a little bit on whether or not it is the biggest threat, just because I spend all day, every day looking at it. So I will just say it is certainly a huge threat. Again, not just to elections, but to social cohesion, and like democracies only function when you have a shared set of facts. And then we argue about what we should do about that set of facts. But if we're living in entirely different realities, which we kind of are now, it becomes really, really difficult to have those, you know, bipartisan fights over what to do about issues. So I do look at it as kind of an existential threat to democracy, because we can't function if we're living in a world that is just kind of fabricated and manipulated. In terms of what we do about it, the sort of easy answer that is often thrown out goes to media and digital literacy. I think it's very, very important, but I say that that is a 20-year solution that needs to be in schools now, into curriculums, hammered home at every step along the way, and then maybe the sort of next generation will be better prepared for what we're seeing. But it's not a sort of silver bullet the way it's often thrown out. And you're not just going to sit into a media digital literacy class for an hour and somehow come out the other end and be bulletproof. That said, if a class exists, take it. It's helpful. And you know, there's different challenges based on age and sort of demographics. Like we look at younger kids. You know, my actual introduction to disinformation was when I was a grad student. I was a teaching assistant, and I would see the students' papers that I was grading were frequently citing RT and Sputnik and other Russian sources. And I would sort of ask them, you know, why they were pulling this source in as sort of a credible information source. And the answer was, again, because RT and Sputnik know how to game information systems. Their content just showed up at the top of their feed. They ran a query for it. That's what came up. They assumed Google was giving them something credible and legitimate, and they just went with it. You know, sort of laziness, and we all are a little lazy, but also not a really great understanding about like how to kind of suss out what is and what is not a credible source of information, and just journalistic best practices and things like that. When we look at sort of older demographics, the problem tends to be a bit more with digital literacy. So photoshopping, manipulated audio, manipulated video, where 15-year-olds just kind of intuitively get how you can manipulate a piece of audio or video content because they've been doing it their whole life. Where those who didn't grow up with Photoshop are a little bit less savvy about how easy it is to create an entirely authentic looking image, just pasting together different things or scrubbing pieces out of a video or a picture. So we've got different challenges kind of across the board. So that, again, it's like the media digital literacy part is the 20-year fix. In the more immediate, there are a lot of things, and I could spend a ton of time talking about them, so I don't want, but there are things we can do to help sort of the health of our information environment. I think part of it starts with pressuring the platforms, but more specifically, the advertisers who advertise on those platforms. We tend to think of ourselves as the the clients or the customer of Facebook and Twitter. We are not. Their clients and customers are advertisers. Facebook is free for all of us. They're the ones paying for it. So if we get advertisers to really double down on, because some have started, and saying, hey, you know, we're just not going to advertise on your platform if you continue to let you know, hate speech, extremist content, state-backed propaganda flourish. So there are a lot of things we can do to kind of start chipping away at the problem, but there's not one solution. There are many, many solutions that will shrink the problem. But again, as long as we live in an open, democratic information environment, which we obviously want to protect, disinformation is going to exist. It just is. If we want to fully protect ourselves, we can do what China has done and create a great firewall, and there can be some overlord who decides what we see and what we don't see. It goes without saying that would be a bad idea. So we have to look at ways of shrinking the problem down, but also understanding that as long as we have an open information space, it's going to be out there.
Yeah, and continue to be vigilant. You know, I want to put together a question I got ahead of time with one that's on in the chat. So it's a two-part question. What, if anything, is the U.S. government doing to deal with disinformation? And of course, you know, a lot of concerns about Facebook, Twitter, but also YouTube has been a problem at times, and other social media. And what could all of these social media platforms do to improve their systems for identifying false information? So it's kind of a two-part. Is the federal government actually doing anything? I've never heard of anything that they're doing. And
they are, but it's limited, and it's limited in a way that I sort of understand that, you know, the government does not feel like they are best positioned to be arbiters of truth and to start demanding that false pieces of information get taken down from platforms. I mean, I think that's really problematic for the government to be in that role. That said, CISA within DHS, that often looks at sort of more state-backed campaigns, their reporting has gotten much better over the past couple of years, and they've started to put out some more public reporting about specific credible threats that they're seeing from foreign adversaries. So I should note, there is greater cooperation at this point between like the FBI and the platforms. So recently, Facebook took down a collection of pages that they had connected back to the Internet Research Agency. That came from a tip from the FBI. So we have seen a little bit better cooperation, certainly better cooperation than we saw in 2016. And that sort of like leads into the next part of it of what the platforms can be doing. In 2016, they were just not paying attention, and there was no coordination. They were not communicating across platforms in any way that was helpful. That has definitely improved. So when we started doing our research in 2017, we would see one platform take down a group of accounts that they had connected to a state-backed actor, so Iran or China running kind of a false information campaign. Twitter would take it down. It would stay up on Facebook for weeks. They're now coordinating in a way that they are kind of collectively going after bad actors. Because as I mentioned, when you run a disinformation campaign, it never exists on one platform. They span it off across many, many ones. The thing that is a problem is we focus a lot on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter. Most of the really pernicious pieces of disinformation and extremist content and hate speech starts on these small or mid-sized platforms that just don't police the platform at all. Some of them are actually created to sort of foster that kind of hateful conversation. So 8chan and 4chan in these places, we see a lot of it start bubbling up in places where nobody is paying attention. They just don't have sort of security teams in place, either because they're too small or again, they don't care. So we see it just spread across many, many different platforms. So even though it may not be reaching the same number of people that you would reach on Facebook, it can really radicalize a smaller group of people in a space where there is just, again, there's no moderation happening at all. One space I would look at specifically this time around and going to like what the league can do and kind of monitoring your own space, I think Nextdoor is a very important platform on election related issues. Nextdoor, if you know it, is a very hyper-localized social media platform where it's essentially just neighbors sharing information with neighbors. For the most part, about water getting cut off and things like that. But we see a lot of election-related content there. And if you were going to really hyper-localize a voter suppression campaign, for example, Nextdoor is the perfect platform to do it because you can go neighborhood by neighborhood. And if you're trying to suppress a certain kind of vote, you know which neighborhoods vote which kind of ways. You can get into those platforms and really start spreading some problematic content. And again, if Nextdoor has a sort of security team or content moderation team, I don't know about it. So I don't think they have any sort of adverse motives, but there's just not a lot of people paying attention there. So I would stress looking at some of the communications platforms that are very local, that are not just Facebook, Twitter, YouTube.
Bret,
Yes.
I'm going to stop you there and let everyone know if they want to stay after our 1 o'clock ending time. I want to be mindful of our timing. We will answer some more questions in a minute. But in closing, I want to invite everyone, males, females, students, to become members of a League of Women Voters. And then to be sure to mark your calendars for our next event, the Baltimore City and Baltimore County League of Women Voters on Wednesday, October 28th, from 12:30 to 1:30. We're going to be learning about polling and the 2020 election. And our speaker will be Mila Cromer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Goucher College. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I hope you've learned a lot and you'll be getting the information that Bret shared, because it really is worthwhile. And I do like that comment about Nextdoor, because there was someone who posted some very off the wall information this week. And I'm going to have to try to figure out how to get things like that taken down. So you don't need to leave, because we'll continue with questions, but I do want to say thank you to everyone who came and joined us. And especially thank you, Bret.
Thank you.